Hi, happy St. George's Day. My name is Jonathan Blitzer. I'm celebrating the day from quarantine here in Brooklyn with the one and only Juan Carlos Onetti, the late, great Uruguayan novelist and short story writer, whose work has always been kind of an uncertain footing in English. He's an extremely enthralling, compelling voice, and those of you who have read him in Spanish or in English just know how captivating he is. There's a community of us out in the world. We consider ourselves Onetianos, devotees of the man himself. And I suspect that there are a number of you out there who have maybe yet to experience Onetti's work, but who are also kind of stealth, latent Donetianos yourselves. And all you need is that nudge toward his fiction for the conversion to be complete. And so to that end, I'm here to read a story of Juan Carlos Onetti's, one of my favorites, a story called Welcome Bob, Bienvenido Bob. And it's been translated expertly, of course, by the great Katherine Silver, and it's been published recently by Archipelago Books in a beautiful volume of Onetti's complete or collected stories in English. So without further ado, I give you Juan Carlos Onetti via Katherine Silver. Welcome, Bob. There's no question that every day he'll get older, farther away from when he was called Bob, from his blonde hair hanging over his temples, from that smile and those sparkling eyes when he'd silently enter the room, murmuring a greeting or slightly moving his hand near his ear, and go to sit down under the lamp near the piano with a book or simply motionless and separate, lost in thought. Looking at us for an hour, his face expressionless, his fingers moving every once in a while to handle his cigarette or to brush ash off the lapels of his light-colored suits. Equally as far away, now that he's called Roberto and gets drunk on anything, covering his mouth with his dirty hand when he coughs. From the Bob who drank beer, no more than 2 glasses, even on the longest of nights, a pile of 10-cent coins for the jukebox on his table at the tavern and the club. Almost always alone, listening to jazz, his face sleepy, blissful, and pale, barely moving his head to greet me as I walk past, following me with his eyes for as long as I'd stay, for as long as it was possible for me to withstand his blue stare, leveled at me indefatigably, effortlessly maintaining his intense disdain and gentler mockery. Or on Sundays, with one or another young man as furiously young as he, with whom he discussed solos, French horns, and choruses, and the infinite city Bob would build along the river when he became an architect. He'd interrupt himself when he saw me walk by to briefly greet me, then not take his eyes off my face, balancing muted words and smiles on the corner of his mouth that pointed toward his companion, who always ended up looking at me and doubling the disdain and mockery in silence. Sometimes I'd feel strong and try to look at him. I'd rest my face on one hand and smoke over my drink, looking at him unblinkingly, maintaining my attention on my own face to keep it cold, a little melancholic. In those days, Bob looked a lot like Ynez. I could see something of her in his face from across the room in the club. And there might have been a night when I looked at him the way I looked at her. But I almost always preferred to forget Bob's eyes, and I'd sit with my back to him and watch the mouths of the people talking at my table, sometimes keeping quiet and sad so that he would know that I had something in me more than what he judged me on, something closer to him. A few drinks would sometimes help, and I would think, "Dear Bob, go tell this to your little sister," while I was caressing the hands of the girls sitting at my table or expanding upon a theory about one thing or another so they would laugh and Bob would hear. But neither Bob's attitude nor his gaze showed any signs of change all that time, no matter what I did. I recall this only as evidence that he never noticed my antics in the tavern. One night, at his house, I was waiting for Ynez next to the piano in the living room when he entered. He had on a raincoat buttoned up to the neck, his hands in his pockets. He nodded at me in greeting, looked around quickly, and walked into the room, as if he had eliminated me with a quick nod. I watched him move about, walking in circles around the table, stepping on the rug with his yellow rubber shoes. He touched a finger to a flower, sat on the edge of the table, and lit a cigarette as he stared at the vase, his serene profile turned toward me as he leaned slightly forward, idle and pensive. Imprudently, I was standing up and leaning against the piano. I played a low note with my left hand, and then felt compelled to repeat the sound every 3 seconds, looking at him. I felt nothing but hatred and shameful respect for him, and I kept pushing on the key, stabbing it with fierce cowardice in the silence of the house, until suddenly I was on the outside, observing the scene as if from the top of the stairs or from the door, seeing him and feeling him, Bob, silent and lost in thought next to the line of smoke that rose tremulously from his cigarette, feeling myself tall and stiff, a little pathetic, a little ridiculous in the shadows, banging on that low note with my index finger every 3 seconds precisely. Then I thought that I wasn't playing a note on the piano with some kind of incomprehensible bravado, but rather that I was calling to him, that the deep note my finger tenaciously revived on the verge of each previous vibration was the only God-forsaken word finally found that I could use to ask for tolerance and understanding from his implacable youth. He remained motionless until Ynez closed the door to her bedroom before coming down to meet me. Then Bob stood up and walked lazily over to the other side of the piano. He leaned his elbow on it, looked at me for a moment, then said with his beautiful smile, "Is tonight a night of milk or of whiskey? An impetus of salvation or a leap into the abyss?" I couldn't say anything. I couldn't smash his face in with one blow. I stopped playing the note, and I slowly withdrew my hand from the piano. Ynez was halfway down the stairs when he said as he walked away, "Well, maybe you'll improvise." The duel lasted for 3 or 4 months, and I couldn't stop frequenting the club at night. I remember, incidentally, that there was a tennis championship going on at the time, because when I didn't show up for a while, Bob would greet my return with increased disdain and sarcasm in his eyes, then settle into his chair with a happy grin. When the time came that I wanted nothing but to marry Ynez as soon as possible, Bob and his tactics changed. I don't know how he found out about my need to marry his sister, and about how I had embraced that need with all the strength I had left. My love of that need had eliminated the past and every bond with the present. I didn't pay much attention to Bob, but a short time later I would remember how he changed during that period. And at one point, I stood motionless on a street corner, cursing him between clenched teeth, understanding that by then his face had ceased to be mocking and now looked at me gravely and with intense calculations, as one looks at a danger or a complex task, as if trying to assess the obstacle or measure it against one's own strength. But he didn't matter to me anymore, and I even came to think that his set and motionless face was beginning to show some understanding of what was fundamental in me, of an old past that was pure, and that my beloved need to marry Ynez had drawn out from under the years and the events, and had brought me closer to him. Later I saw that Bob was waiting for night, but only I saw it when he arrived that night and came to sit down at the table where I was sitting alone, and signaled to the waiter to go away. I waited a while, stared at him. He looked so much like Ynez when he moved his eyebrows, and the tip of his nose, like hers, how it would flatten a little when he talked. "You're not going to marry Ynez," he said at last. I looked at him, smiled, then looked away. "No, you're not going to marry her, because something like that can be prevented if there is someone who is really resolved to stop it." I smiled again. "A few years ago," I told him, "that would have made me want to marry Ynez even more. Now it doesn't even make any difference at all. But I can listen to you if you wish to explain." He lifted his head and remained staring at me in silence. Maybe he already had his sentences ready and was waiting for me to complete mine to speak them. "If you wish to explain to me why you don't want me to marry her," I said slowly, then leaned back against the wall. Directly I saw that I had never suspected how much, or with how deep a resolve, he hated me. His face was pale, his smile tight and fixed between his teeth and his lips. "I'd have to divide it into chapters," he said, "and the night would never end. But it can be stated in 2 or 3 words. You are not going to marry her because you are old and she is young. I don't know if you were 30 or 40, and it doesn't matter, but you are a grown man, or rather a broken down one, like all men at your age who are not extraordinary," he said, sucking on his extinguished cigarette. and looking out to the street, then back at me. My head was pressed against the wall, and I still waited. You probably have your own reasons to believe there's something extraordinary about you, he said, to believe that you have rescued something from the shipwreck. But it's not true. I lit a cigarette, turning my profile toward him. He was a nuisance, but I didn't believe him. He made me feel lukewarm hatred, but I was sure that nothing would make me doubt myself after having recognized my need to marry Ynez. No, we were sitting at the same table, and I was as clean and as young as he. You might be wrong, I told him. If you would like to name something about me that's broken. No, he said quickly. I'm not that childish. I'm not going to play this game. You're selfish. You're a sensualist in a dirty way. You're attached to miserable things, and those things control you. You're not going anywhere, and you don't really want to. That's all, nothing else. You're old and she's young. I shouldn't even be thinking about her in your presence. And yet you expect to, not even that I could smash him in the face, so I decided to be done with him, walked over to the jukebox, punched in something, and inserted a coin. I returned to my seat slowly and listened. The music wasn't very loud. Someone was singing sweetly between long pauses. Next to me, Bob was saying that not even he, someone like him, had the right to look Ynez in the eyes. Poor kid, I thought, with admiration. He was going on about how, during what he called old age, the most revolting thing, what caused the breakdown, or rather what symbolized the breakdown, was thinking in concepts, including all women in the word woman, carelessly pushing them to adapt to the concept created by some pathetic experience. But he also said the word experience was not even exact. There were no experiences anymore, only habits and repetitions, withered names to attach to things and bit by bit create them. That's more or less what he said. And I was gently thinking, what if he dropped dead or found a way to kill me right then and there? What if I described to him the images that he conjured for me when he said that not even he deserved to touch Ynez with the tip of his finger, the poor kid, or to kiss the edge of her garments, her footprint, or things like that? After a pause, the music had ended, and the lights in the jukebox had gone out, increasing the silence. Bob said, "That's all," and walked off with his usual stride, confident, neither fast nor slow. If that night Ynez's face appeared to me in Bob's features, if at some moment the fraternal similarities used the trick of a gesture to give me Ynez through Bob, then that was the last time I saw the girl. It's true. I was with her again 2 nights later for the customary debriefing, and my desperation demanded that we meet one day at noon, futile, knowing beforehand that any recourse to words or presence was futile, that all my monotonous pleas would die in a rather astonishing way, as if they had never even existed, dissolved in the enormous blue of the plaza under the soft green foliage in the middle of the best season of the year. The smell and swift parts of Ynez's face that Bob had shown me that night, though directed against me and married to his aggression, shared the girl's enthusiasm and frankness. But how was I to speak to Ynez, touch her, convince her through the suddenly indifferent woman of our last 2 encounters? How to recognize her, or even evoke her while looking at that woman with a long, stiff body in the armchair at her house and on the bench in the plaza, equally stiff and resolved and held upright on those 2 different dates and in 2 different plazas, that woman whose neck was tense, her eyes staring forward, her mouth dead, her hands planted firmly on her lap. I looked at her, and she was no. I knew that all the air surrounding her was no. I never found out which anecdote Bob had chosen. In any case, I'm sure he didn't lie, sure that at the time nothing, not even Ynez, could make him lie. I never saw either Ynez or her stiffened, voided form again. I heard she got married and no longer lived in Buenos Aires. At the time, in the midst of my hatred and suffering, I liked to imagine Bob imagining facts about me and choosing just the right one, or the right combination that was capable of killing me and Ynez and killing her for me. It's been almost a year now since I've been seeing Bob almost every day in the same cafe, surrounded by the same people. When he was introduced to me, now he's called Roberto, I understood that the past had no tense, and yesterday joins hands with a date from 10 years before. There were still some worn-out traces of Ynez in his face, and a certain movement of Bob's mouth managed to make me see once again the girl's long body, her calm and poised steps, and make the same unchanged blue eyes look at me again under her loose coiffure, crisscrossed and tied with a red ribbon. Absent and lost forever, she could remain alive and intact, forever unmistakable, identical to her own essence. But it was painstaking to dig into Roberto's face, his words, his gestures, to find Bob and be able to hate him. The afternoon of the first encounter, I waited for hours for him to be alone, or to leave so I could talk to him, or to beat him up. Still and silent, staring sometimes at his face, or conjuring up Ynez in the shiny windows of the cafe, I meticulously composed the insulting sentences, and found the patient tone to utter them, and I chose the exact spot on his body to land the first blow. But he left that evening in the company of 3 friends, and I decided to wait, as I had waited years before, for the propitious night when we would be alone. The next time I saw him, when we began this second friendship, that I hope will never end, I stopped thinking about any kind of assault. It was decided that I would never talk to him about Ynez or the past, and in silence I would hold everything that was alive inside me. That's all I do, almost every afternoon, in the presence of Roberto and the familiar faces in the cafe. My hatred will be kept warm and new as long as I can continue seeing and listening to Roberto. Nobody knows of my revenge, but I live it with rage and joy from one day to the next. I talk to him, smile, smoke, drink coffee, the whole time thinking about Bob, his purity, his faith, the audacity of his former dreams. Thinking about the Bob who loved music, the Bob who planned to embellish the lives of mankind by building a city of blinding beauty for 5 million inhabitants along the banks of the river. The Bob who could never lie, the Bob who proclaimed the struggle of the young against the old. Bob, the owner of the future and the world. Thinking meticulously and calmly about all that in the presence of the man with tobacco-stained fingers named Roberto, who leads a disgusting life working in some foul-smelling office, is married to a fat woman he calls the wife. The man who spends long Sundays sunk in his chair in the cafe, poring through newspapers and betting on horses by telephone. Nobody ever loved a woman with the force that I love his debasement. How definitively he is sunk into the filthy life of men. Nobody has been as enthralled by love as I am by his fleeting sorrows, the lackluster projects that a broken and far-away Bob sometimes recites to himself, and that serve only to measure the precise extent to which he has been forever besmirched. I don't know if I ever welcomed Ynez with as much joy and love as I welcome Bob into the gloomy and malodorous world of adults every day. He's still a newcomer, and once in a while he suffers an attack of nostalgia. I have seen him tearful and drunk, throwing insults at himself and promising the imminent return of the days of Bob. I can confirm that at those moments my heart overflows with love and becomes affectionate and sensitive, like a mother's. Deep down I know that he will never go anywhere because he has nowhere to go. But I become delicate and patient, and I try to appease him. Like that fistful of native soil, or those photographs of streets and monuments, or the songs immigrants like to carry with them. I set about constructing for him plans, beliefs, and different tomorrows, with the light and flavor of the country of youth, from which he arrived some time ago. And he accepts. He always demands that I redouble my promises, but he ends up saying yes. Finally, he manages the grimace of a smile, believing that someday he will return to that world and the hours of Bob, and he rests in peace in the middle of his 30s, moving without chagrin or missteps among the horrific corpses of former ambitions, the repulsive shapes of dreams that have been ground down under the mindless, constant pressure of so many thousands of unavoidable